So what happened?
Well, what did
I shouldn't be smiling, and I know it's a hard story. I'm assuming it's a hard story for you to tell, and I also know that you've told it a lot of times, and so I imagine you're probably tired of telling it, but I think it's like,
Well,
I mean, it
yeah,
epitomizes
I don't think I can
that.
like muster the energy to tell like the full blocked and reported version.
That's
Uh,
okay. We can send people over to Blocked and
yeah,
Reported to listen to the full detailed
but I,
story.
but I will say that was Katie Herzog, who is one of the co-hosts of Blocked and Reported. She's a dear friend, and she encouraged me to come on and like tell the full story. And I was sick over it. I was surprised by how sensitive I still was to trying to articulate that experience and the fear I had that like it was almost like a magical feeling. Like if I say too much about it, like it's such a emotionally bizarre experience for a human to go through public shaming on such a big level, as I know you can relate, that you're not quite sane on the other side of it. And so you just have to manage your insanity as responsibly as you can. But I will say, I really appreciate that Katie had me do that exercise, because I'm no longer there. Like, I can tell you and talk to you about this story now in a way that I just couldn't before I put it all out there, went through it all, and realized like nothing bad happened. And the world kept spinning. So yeah, it's not that it's too painful. I just, I feel like I've lived a very interesting life, and I shake my fist at the fact that this thing happened to me that became such a big part of my life story. But I must confess that I also think it's interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to go over parts of it you want. I mean, the short version of it is just that 2020 was like a very big year for journalism. You've got the pandemic, you've got the uprisings and the riots and the quote unquote racial reckoning happening throughout American culture, and of course you have the presidential election, which was super high stakes. And I covered all three of those things for the New York Times, as well as I put out a series called Rabbit Hole that was an investigation of all the ways that the internet is radicalizing people, whether they mean to or not, and how it was hard to keep your bearings of what you really believed if you spent a lot of time online, because we are by our nature very impressionable and very tribal as people. And this was a series that essentially was showing that like if you spend a bunch of your time on the internet, you might find yourself holding radically different views than you did beforehand without even quite realizing the change you were going through. We focused a lot on like QAnon and more right leaning figures, but if you go listen to it, you'll hear that the whole time I'm saying like this is also happening to people on the left. In light of recent events, I now wonder if it wouldn't be smart for us to try and do a similar series that like we did with Rabbit Hole, but specifically looking at how some of these people on the American left, probably the Canadian left as well, have gotten so far down these radical views. Because I just don't. I think that it's underreported, because a lot of reporters like us who work at places with resources, they did. We were focusing a lot on the alt right. We were focusing on this, and I think now the left is actually more interesting. And it's just tough, because like if you go down the left, like you're also going to include people that may hold positions of power in the very media companies that you're working at. Anyway, long way of saying 2020 was a great year for journalism, and I got to work on all these big stories, and it was a fantastic year in my career. And I ended the year 2020 with a big promotion. I had just found out that I'd been nominated for 2 very big and prestigious awards that I was super pumped about. And then I found myself quite suddenly and unexpectedly caught up in I guess one of the final 2020 cancel culture events that would happen right at the end of the year 2020. They snuck one more in, and it was me. So yeah, that's essentially what happened. I can, whatever details you'd like, I can give, but it eventually would start on Twitter and it would end weeks later with me stepping down from my job. The Times is a very smart business. They are so good at making money. And yet even they, with all their resources, they had no game plan. And this is what they told me. Like, as soon as Twitter one day started saying how terrible I was, I got a call from somebody at the Times who works in PR and crisis management. And she definitely there's enough in play to say hey, we want to make sure you're not just sitting there reading all this stuff. Do you have a mental health care professional, or do you want us to get you one on the company, talk to a therapist? Are you with your friends? Are there people around? And they say it's our experience that when people go through something like this, it can really be distressing, and we want to make sure you're in a safe place that you don't get hurt. They had my back. They had that. But then even on the same call, I'm like, so what do we do? And she said, we don't exactly know yet the strategy that makes this go away. So the first thing we do is we try to ignore it. And it's hard, but we're going to just try and ignore it and hope that it goes away. That was what they did back then. And of course, it didn't go away, and it snowballed. And eventually it started to catch other people I worked with into it. And there were challenges made online that out to my friends and colleagues that if they wouldn't distance themselves from me, there'd be consequences for them. Some of those same guys I was just talking about how much I loved working with them at Radiolab, and I felt like they were my crew. Some of them felt pressured to publicly distance themselves from me, which was especially heartbreaking. And even I didn't know, Megan, I didn't quite know if I should or shouldn't say something. Part of me just wanted to be I'm really, really sorry for all the things I did, but I can't apologize for the things I didn't do. You're accusing me of serious crimes.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to say. How do you show humility and say, oh, I'm super embarrassed about these things? And of course, as a person, even now, I have so much to grow on. I'm not some freak, it's some egotistical monster. I own this stuff I did. But what you're actually accusing me of and trying to force me out of my job for, this is false accusations. If the criminal justice system worked the way that the social justice system that you guys are pushing worked, which, by the way, the same crowd, very critical of the criminal justice system for all the ways in which it could be more just. I agree with them on some of that. But the draconian nature of the social justice system, they seem so blind to it. And I didn't know how to communicate that. And so I didn't say anything, and I hoped it went away, and it didn't. And now we look back a few years later, and I think that I know what I could say, and I know what I could have done. And I think even the Times has changed their strategy a lot to not succumb to these things. And even my friends, I'm still friends with many people at the Times, they all agree that this would not happen now. If the exact same thing happened today that happened in December of 2020, wow, it's already been 4 years. If that happened today, just like it did then, I'd be fine. I'd still have my job. Which is mad. Just so you know, they're not calling to tell me they'd like me to take the job back.
They're just saying if this hadn't happened at the time it did happen. I mean, that's the thing is that, it probably wouldn't, for sure, it wouldn't go down today the way it went down then. So it's hard to even say, what would you do differently? I don't know if there is, do you think that there was something that could have been done at that time in 2020 that would have led to a better or more fair outcome?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with hindsight, it's so much clearer to see. I mean, thing one is the company should have just released a statement that simply said, we have investigated Andy and his behavior and the crimes that he's being accused of having commit on the internet are baseless and untrue. He remains sorry for dumping the drink on the woman's head, but that happened in 2014 at a different job. That is not a fireable offense in 2020 at a different job. In fact, it's against the rules of the union that I was a part of to penalize me in my current job for that. And we are moving on. And people would have been mad for 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, maybe a week. And then they just would have moved on to somebody else. It would have been, just give it a little time. And then it would have especially been good had I not been in the emotional distress I was in. And if I could have articulated then what I can now, it's just like when you're in the middle of a public shaming, part of you do feel like a witch when everyone's shouting witch. Like there's a little part. I was thinking about sins that I could, the old Christian me was coming back. I was like thinking of sins I committed as a young person. I was like, well, maybe I do deserve this. Like maybe deep down I am a really bad person. So I was in no position to give a quote to Brian Stelter at CNN or, Eric Wimple at Washington Post when they're calling. Because, and also this, the truth is like when you get a call, this is like one of the things that makes the story so interesting. I mentioned this talking to Tara, but I think it bears repeating. The worst part as a journalist going through this was that it was one thing when people were like saying this stuff on Twitter, and I'm not very famous, so I don't know. It was a few thousand people, whatever. It's not the end of the world. But when I got the call from the Washington Post, when I got the call from CNN, when I got the call from NPR that they were now going to do a story on it, my heart didn't go, oh, well, thank goodness. Reporters are getting in. Now that reporters are they're going to get to the bottom of it, and this will all get cleared up. No, I had the opposite. I was like, oh no. These guys are going to use this to get attention on the internet, and there's no way they're interested in telling the true story.
Right.
And that's really heartbreaking.